I missed the train by less than a minute. It was one of those ordinary evenings where nothing is supposed to happen. The platform lights were already on. The air had that cold metal smell from the tracks, and my coat felt heavier than it should have as I stood there catching my breath. I checked the sign, then my watch, then the empty stretch of rail like that could change anything. The doors had closed. The train slid away, quietly. No drama, just gone. So I did what you do. I went back up the stairs, walked out to the street, and called my son to tell him I'd be spending the night. When I let myself into their apartment, I kept my movements small out of habit. Shoes off, purse on the little table by the door. I could hear the baby monitor from the living room, that soft, static hiss. The place smelled faintly like detergent and reheated pasta. It was familiar. I'd been in and out of that home for a year. Then I heard Jessica's voice, low and tight, and my son answering her in the same tone, not arguing exactly, planning. "She'll do it," Jessica said. "She always does. She thinks she's helping." And Stephen replied, "Once it's done, we just move her into a place. She won't fight it. She won't even understand what she signed." I didn't step into the room. I didn't make a sound. I just stopped in the hallway with my hand on the wall, and for a second my legs didn't feel like mine. The paint under my fingertips was slightly rough, like it had been rolled on too fast. I slid down until I was sitting on the floor, my knees drawn in, my mouth covered so no noise would come out. I remember noticing the baseboard needed wiping. That's the kind of thing my mind did back then. Even in shock, it went looking for chores. I stayed there, still and quiet, while my heart thudded hard enough to make my throat ache. Their voices carried through the doorway, calm, practical, like they were talking about a grocery run. Somewhere behind them, the baby monitor crackled again, and the sound felt strange and far away. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed in my purse. I didn't reach for it. I didn't want the screen lighting up in that hallway. I just sat there and listened until their footsteps moved, until a cabinet closed, until the room went quiet. Later, much later, there would be a manila envelope on a lawyer's desk with my name on it. There would be photographs I took with shaking hands. There would be a phone call I made that I hadn't planned to make when I woke up that morning. But that night, on the floor in their hallway, all I knew was that I had heard words I wasn't meant to hear, and I couldn't pretend they hadn't landed inside me. I put the phone face down in my purse and forced myself to breathe the way I used to when Stephen was a child, and I had to stay calm for both of us. In through the nose, out slowly, count to 4. Then wait. I should tell you how I got to that hallway, because it didn't start with a missed train. It started with trust. A year earlier, Stephen called me on a weekday afternoon while I was rinsing a mug at my own sink. The faucet ran too hot, and steam curled up around my hands. I remember, because my fingers were already dry and cracked that season, and the heat stung. His voice sounded worried in a way I hadn't heard since he was young. "Mom," he said, "I need you to come. Jessica's pregnant. The doctor says bed rest, it's serious." There was a pause, like he was choosing his words carefully. Then he said, "We can't afford help. I have to work. You're the only one I trust." Trust is a powerful word when it comes from your child. It goes straight past your common sense. It sits right in the center of your chest. I dried my hands on a dish towel and stared at the pattern on it like I needed it to steady me. I asked a few practical questions. Which doctor? What kind of bed rest? How long? He answered quickly, almost rehearsed. "We'll figure it out week by week. We just need you right now." I didn't ask for paperwork. I didn't ask to hear it from the doctor. I didn't ask anything that would have made me feel suspicious. Because I wasn't suspicious. I was a mother. I was a widow who had raised one son alone. And when he sounded scared, my body moved before my mind finished thinking. "I'll come every day," I told him. "Don't worry about a thing." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long minute with the towel in my hands. The refrigerator hummed. A neighbor's door closed down the hall. My apartment was quiet and ordinary, and I remember feeling a small, grim sense of purpose settle over me, like putting on an apron. That evening, I set my alarm for 5 a.m. and laid out my clothes on a chair so I wouldn't have to think in the morning. I packed containers from my own pantry, the kind with lids that never quite snapped on the first try. I wrote a short list on the back of an old envelope: coffee, eggs, fruit, bread, just so I felt organized. Then I washed the mug I'd already washed once, wiped down a counter that was already clean, and tried to ignore the tightness in my stomach that I mistook for nerves. When the alarm went off in the dark, I got up anyway. I made coffee. I stood by the window while it brewed and watched the streetlights flicker on wet pavement. Then I picked up my bag, checked my keys twice, and left my own home while it was still sleeping. The first morning I did it, the train car smelled like damp coats and cheap cologne. The seats were still warm from other bodies, and the windows had that cloudy film from everyone's breath. I sat with my bag on my lap, hands folded over it, watching the same row of buildings slide by that I would watch for the next 12 months. I told myself it was temporary, a few weeks, maybe 2 months. Bed rest meant serious. Serious meant you show up. I arrived at their building a little before 8. The lobby was too bright, and the mailboxes were covered in fingerprints. I remember the elevator mirror because it made me look tired even then. When I reached their door, I didn't knock. Stephen had given me a key on the first day. "So you don't wake her," he'd said, and he said it like it was thoughtful, like it was a kindness I was helping him provide. Inside, the apartment was quiet but not peaceful. There were dishes in the sink like they'd been there overnight. A sweet, slightly sour smell came from the trash can. A throw blanket was half on the couch, half on the floor. I set my bag down and started moving automatically, the way you do when you're in someone else's space and you're trying to make yourself useful without being in the way. I put the containers in the refrigerator. I rinsed cups and lined them up on the drying rack. I wiped crumbs off the counter with a paper towel that tore too easily. I started the coffee maker because I knew Stephen drank it before work. It was all small, ordinary motion, nothing dramatic, just routine. Stephen came out of the bedroom around 8:30, already dressed, adjusting his tie with one hand while he checked his phone with the other. He kissed my cheek quickly. "Thanks, Mom," he said, like he was late for something important. "You're an angel." Then he was gone. The first time Jessica came out, she moved slowly, one hand on her belly, like she was performing what she thought a pregnant woman should look like. She didn't sit up straight. She didn't greet me the way I would have greeted a guest. She looked at the kitchen like it was a room in a hotel that hadn't been cleaned properly. "I'm hungry," she said. "No, good morning. No, how are you? Just hungry." I made her breakfast and put it on a plate the way Stephen liked when he was young. Eggs, toast, fruit, because that's what my hands knew how to do when someone I loved needed care. She ate on the couch, scrolling through her phone, eyes barely lifting toward me. If something wasn't perfect, she said it plainly, like she was reporting a mistake to customer service. "The toast is too hard," or "the juice tastes weird." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The tone did the work, and I corrected it. I corrected it because I told myself she was scared, pregnant, on bed rest, hormones. I gave her every benefit I could find. After breakfast came what I started to think of as the list, even when it wasn't written down. It was always delivered the same way, like instructions, not requests. "Carol, the bathroom needs to be done again. I still see spots. Carol, the curtains are dusty. Carol, can you run to the store? We're out of a few things. Carol, the baby clothes I ordered are here. Wash them by hand. The machine is too rough." At first, I thought some of it made sense. A pregnant woman shouldn't be lifting, shouldn't be bending, shouldn't be scrubbing. But the days stacked up. The tasks multiplied. Things that didn't feel urgent became urgent because she wanted them done now. I found myself doing laundry that wasn't even theirs, because she'd pull out a bag of clothes and say, "These need to be ironed," and I wouldn't ask why. I would just set up the ironing board and start smoothing fabric while she watched television. The iron hissed with steam. My shoulders tightened. I kept going. There were moments that should have stopped me, even then. Like the first time I heard her laughing on the phone in the living room while I was on my knees scrubbing the kitchen floor. "Yeah," she said, and she wasn't whispering. "It's a drag, but at least his mom comes every day. It's basically free help." Free help. I paused with the sponge in my hand and let the words settle. The tile was cold under my knees. The smell of lemon cleaner was sharp in my nose. I told myself not to take it personally. I told myself she was talking the way her friends talked. I told myself she didn't mean it the way it sounded. That became a pattern too, hearing something that stung, then working hard to sand down the sting until I could keep functioning. My friends noticed the change before I did. They'd call in the evening, and I'd decline invitations because I was still on the train, or still washing dishes, or still too exhausted to speak. They started to stop asking. My world narrowed to their schedule and the train timetable. By the 3rd month, my body had learned the rhythm so deeply that even on days I didn't need to go, I woke up before my alarm. My back hurt in a steady, dull way. My hands looked older than they used to. I would stand at my own sink at night, rubbing lotion into my fingers, and tell myself it was worth it. It was for my son. It was for the baby. There was one day, my sister Nancy came by my apartment and saw me packing containers in my kitchen, like I was prepping for a week-long trip. "She's using you," Nancy said. She didn't soften it. "And Stephen is letting her. You're not helping. You're being installed as staff." I remember the way my chest tightened when she said it. Not because she was wrong, but because a part of me recognized something I didn't want to recognize. I got defensive. I told her she didn't understand. I told her she was being harsh. I said, "Jessica is pregnant, Nancy. She's on bed rest. I'm doing what any mother would do." Nancy looked at me for a long time, like she was weighing whether to argue or let me learn it the hard way. "Fine," she said finally. "Just don't say I didn't warn you." After she left, I stood in the doorway of my apartment and listened to the building settle, pipes clicking, a distant television through someone else's wall. I felt unsettled, but instead of stopping, I doubled down. The next morning, I got up at 5 again. I made the coffee. I packed the food. I caught the 6:30 train, and I kept going, day after day, week after week, telling myself that sacrifice was what made me a good mother, and that if I stayed useful, everything would stay safe. I didn't understand yet that staying useful was exactly what made me easy to control. The months blended together in a way that made it hard to tell one from the next. The weather shifted outside the train windows, but inside their apartment, everything stayed the same. The same couch, the same television murmuring in the background, the same list, spoken in the same flat voice. By the 6th month, Jessica's belly was unmistakable, round and heavy, and she used it like punctuation. She rubbed it when she wanted something. She sighed loudly when she was displeased. She leaned back and closed her eyes whenever she didn't feel like engaging, as if her body itself was a reason no one could question her. Stephen started coming home later. At first, it was small changes, 7 instead of 6, then 8, sometimes later. He always had an explanation ready, and I never asked follow-up questions. I was too busy clearing plates, wiping counters, packing leftovers into containers so they wouldn't go to waste. "Big project," he'd say, loosening his tie. "I'm doing this for the baby." I nodded every time. I wanted to believe that sentence because it justified everything else. I rarely sat down anymore. I ate standing at the kitchen counter after they were finished, chewing quickly so I could wash dishes before catching the train. The metal sink was always cold against my stomach. At night, when I finally got home, my apartment felt like a hotel room I no longer lived in. Dust settled where I hadn't dusted. Mail stacked up on the table. I showered, lay down, and waited for the alarm. There was a day I nearly fainted. I was cleaning the lower cabinets, crouched down, and when I stood up, the room went dark around the edges. I grabbed the counter and stayed very still. My heart thudded unevenly, like it couldn't decide on a rhythm. Jessica walked in and looked at me the way you look at someone blocking your path. "What's wrong with you?" she asked. "Nothing," I said after a second. "Just dizzy." She frowned. "Drink some water," she said, already turning away. "And when you're done, I need lunch." I waited until she left the room before I let myself breathe properly. Then I straightened up and kept going. There were other moments, too, small ones. The way she'd talk about me on the phone like I wasn't there. The way she'd correct me in front of people who came to visit, even when I hadn't done anything wrong. The way Stephen avoided meeting my eyes when she snapped at me. Once I heard her laugh and say, "Just a little longer, then we'll figure out what to do with her." I stood in the kitchen with a knife in my hand, chopping vegetables, and the words echoed in my head, "Figure out what to do with her." I told myself she meant me taking a break, or hiring help later, or anything other than what it sounded like. I had gotten very good at translating discomfort into something harmless. 3 weeks before the due date, Stephen asked if I could stay over for a few nights. "Just in case," he said. "I don't want her alone if something happens." I packed a small bag and slept on the couch. The cushions were too soft in the wrong places and too firm in others. I woke up with a stiff neck and an ache between my shoulders that never quite went away. At night, I lay there listening to the apartment breathe, pipes, refrigerator, the baby monitor waiting for a sound that hadn't come yet. One night, I got up to use the bathroom and passed their bedroom. The door was slightly open. I didn't mean to listen. I wasn't leaning in. I was just walking by. "Once the baby's here," Stephen said quietly, "we'll move forward. She won't make a fuss." Jessica laughed, soft and confident. "She's too nice. She believes everything you tell her." I stood there longer than I should have. The hallway light hummed overhead. My hand rested on the door frame, and I remember thinking how smooth the wood felt under my fingers. I went back to the couch and lay down without turning on any lights. I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling and waited for morning, telling myself I didn't have enough information to understand what they meant, that I shouldn't jump to conclusions, that I was tired. After that, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Brochures left out on the table and then quickly moved. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Looks exchanged when they thought I wasn't paying attention. One afternoon, while straightening the desk in the spare room, I saw a stack of glossy pamphlets. Senior living, retirement communities, monthly rates printed neatly at the bottom. I picked one up and felt my stomach drop. My name wasn't on it. Nothing was addressed to me, but it didn't feel accidental. When Jessica came in, she saw it in my hand and took it without asking. "Oh, that," she said lightly. "A friend's mom is looking." I nodded and put my attention back on the papers I was sorting, even though my hands were shaking. I didn't say anything. I didn't confront her. I put the moment in the same place I'd put all the others, on a shelf in my mind labeled "Deal with this later." The baby was born on a Tuesday morning. I was there for the rush to the hospital, the long hours of waiting, the relief when Stephen came out smiling. I held my grandson and felt something real and uncomplicated for the first time in months. For a little while, I thought everything might settle, that maybe all the unease had been in my head. It wasn't. The week after they came home, Stephen went back to work. Jessica stopped pretending. Orders replaced requests completely. One night, I fell asleep sitting up with the baby in my arms and woke to her shouting, panic sharp in her voice. She took the baby from me like I'd done something unforgivable. I sat there afterward, hands empty, listening to the bedroom door close. 2 weeks later, while folding laundry, I heard Stephen on the phone on the balcony. His voice was calm, almost relieved. "Yes," he said. "Everything's ready. The papers are done. She can't stop it." I put the phone face down in my pocket and stood very still. That was the moment something inside me stopped trying to explain things away. I didn't act yet. I didn't say anything. I just watched, and I waited. And then, the night I missed the train came back to me in a different light, like a memory rearranging itself. Because by then, I already knew the truth was there. I just hadn't opened the drawer yet. I went home the next morning instead of staying. I told Stephen I felt sick and needed a day to rest. He didn't argue. He sounded relieved, actually, and that stayed with me longer than it should have. On the train back, I sat by the window and watched my reflection flicker over the glass as we passed through tunnels. My face looked unfamiliar to me, older, sharper around the eyes. I didn't cry on that ride. I just held my bag and waited. When I reached my apartment, the quiet felt heavy. Dust had settled on the coffee table. The air smelled stale, like a place that hadn't been lived in properly. I set my bag down and stood there for a while, listening to nothing. Then I sat at my kitchen table and took out my phone. I called my sister. Nancy answered on the second ring. I didn't explain. I just said, "You were right," and my voice broke before I could stop it. She said she'd be there in an hour. When she arrived, she didn't ask questions. She hugged me, and I let myself lean into it, the way I hadn't leaned on anyone in a long time. We sat at the table, and I told her everything, not emotionally, just in order. The early mornings, the comments, the brochures, the conversations I'd overheard, the words about papers and plans. Nancy listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening a little more with each detail. When I finished, she didn't comfort me. She didn't say it would be okay. She said, "They're committing fraud." The word landed hard but clean. That afternoon, she made calls, one to a lawyer she trusted, one to an accountant. She took notes on a legal pad like this was a project she intended to finish properly. I watched from across the table, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. The lawyer saw us the next morning. He was calm, methodical. He asked questions that didn't invite feelings, dates, locations, documents. When I told him about the papers I'd seen, the forged signature, his pen stopped moving. "If those documents exist," he said, "we need proof. Photographs, clear images, every page. I didn't react right away. The idea of going back into that apartment with a different purpose felt unreal, but Nancy nodded immediately. "She can do that," she said. "We'll do it carefully." That was the first time I noticed something shift, not outside, inside me. For the first time in a year, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. We made a plan, and it was simple. Step 1, I go back on Monday morning like I always do. Same time, same routine. Step 2, Nancy waits at a cafe nearby. If I don't text her by a certain time, she comes up. Step 3, I photograph everything and leave it exactly as I found it. No confrontation, no questions, just evidence. Monday morning came quietly. I dressed the same way I always did, packed food the same way, took the same train. I even felt the same mild ache in my back when I stood up from my seat. Routine has a way of calming the body, even when the mind knows better. When I let myself into their apartment, the baby was sleeping. Jessica was in the shower. The sound of running water filled the hallway. I started the coffee maker like always. I moved through the kitchen like always. Then I went to the desk. The drawer slid open easily. Inside were the documents I'd seen before, stacked neatly. I took out my phone and began photographing each page slowly, making sure the names and signatures were clear. My hands were steady. I noticed that, and it surprised me. Halfway through, footsteps. The shower stopped. A door opened. Jessica came into the room and froze when she saw me with the phone in my hand. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I was looking for a pen," I said, and the lie came out smoothly. Too smoothly. She watched me for a long second, then pointed toward the kitchen. "They're in there. They've always been in there." I nodded, put the phone in my pocket, and walked out. My heart didn't race. It felt slow and deliberate, like it had decided to stay in control. I finished making breakfast. I served her. She watched me closely while she ate, but she didn't say anything else. At 11, I told her I needed to leave. She smiled in a way that no longer fooled me. "We don't really need you that much anymore," she said. I left without responding. Outside, the air felt sharp and clean. I walked straight to the cafe where Nancy was waiting. I sat down across from her and slid my phone onto the table. "I got enough," I said. She smiled just once and nodded. Then we went to the lawyer. I sat in his office while he scrolled through the photos, zooming in on signatures, dates, seals. He didn't speak for a while. When he finally looked up, he said, "This is sufficient. We can move." I put the phone face down on the desk and waited. That was the moment I understood something clearly. Whatever happened next wouldn't be decided by raised voices or explanations. It would be decided by paperwork, and I was ready for that. The lawyer moved quickly after that. He explained things in a steady voice, as if he were outlining a routine process instead of something that involved my son. Asset freezes, formal complaints, notices that would be delivered whether anyone liked it or not. I listened, nodding, asking questions only when something wasn't clear. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I let the system do what it was designed to do. By late afternoon, the paperwork was filed. On the walk back to my apartment, Nancy stayed close to my side, but we didn't talk much. Traffic passed. A bus hissed as it stopped at the corner. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed loudly. The city went on exactly as it always did, and that steadiness helped. It reminded me that my situation, however painful, was contained. It had edges. It had procedures. That night, my phone lit up again and again. Stephen's name. Messages stacking on top of each other. I didn't open them. I didn't need to. I put the phone face down on the table and made myself a simple dinner. Soup from a can. Toast. I ate slowly, sitting down properly, something I hadn't done in months. Nancy slept on my couch. I lay in my own bed and stared at the ceiling, but it wasn't the same kind of sleeplessness as before. My mind wasn't racing. It was organizing. The next morning, the lawyer called to confirm the freezes were active, accounts locked, properties flagged, a formal summons issued. He spoke like this was all very normal, and in his world, it was. At 11, there was pounding on my door. I didn't move right away. I stayed where I was, hands folded in my lap, listening. The pounding came again, harder this time. "Mom," Stephen called through the door. His voice sounded strained, unfamiliar. "I need to talk to you." Nancy stood up quietly and went to the door. "You need to leave," she said through it. "If you don't, I'll call the police. There was a pause, then footsteps moving away, the elevator dinging. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The messages changed tone after that. Explanations, confusion, claims of misunderstandings. One long text insisting I had signed documents months ago and just didn't remember. I read that one twice, then deleted it. On Wednesday, they came together. I could hear their voices through the door before they knocked. Jessica's sharp whisper, Stephen trying to sound calm. "You have 5 minutes," Nancy called out. "Then you leave." They didn't argue. They didn't knock again. They stood there for a while, talking quietly, then left. I stayed seated the entire time, my back straight against the chair, my hands still. Friday came faster than I expected. The lawyer asked me to be present at the prosecutor's office. "Just in case," he said. "It's better if you're available." The building was plain, gray walls, hard chairs, a waiting room that smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. I sat with Nancy beside me and watched people come and go. No one looked at me. No one knew what I was there for. When I was called in, I answered questions simply, no embellishment, no emotion. Did I sign these documents? No. Did I authorize the transfers? No. When did I first become aware of them? I gave dates, locations, facts. I saw Stephen briefly in the hallway afterward. He looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders hunched, suit wrinkled. Our eyes met for a second. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I kept walking. Outside, the light felt too bright. I stood on the steps for a moment, letting it settle on my face. The lawyer joined us and said the words I'd been waiting for. "It's proceeding," he said. "Now we wait." Waiting turned out to be easier than I expected. Days passed, then weeks. I didn't go back to their apartment. I didn't answer calls. I went for walks in the morning. I cleaned my kitchen properly. I read books I'd left unfinished. My body began to feel like it belonged to me again. Eventually, the lawyer called with an update. They wanted to settle, return everything, quietly, no trial. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I stood by my window, watching a man walk his dog across the street. The dog stopped to sniff the same patch of grass twice. "I want everything back," I said finally, "and I want it in writing." That afternoon, I put the phone face down on the table and waited again. Some things, I had learned, are best handled without hurry. The agreement took longer than I expected, not because anyone was arguing the facts, but because paperwork moves at its own pace. Drafts went back and forth. Clauses were adjusted. Words mattered. The lawyer read everything out loud to me once, slowly, even the parts that sounded repetitive. I appreciated that. I wanted to hear it all, not just assume it was fine. Stephen asked, through his lawyer, if he could speak to me. 5 minutes, neutral location, no pressure. I said yes, with conditions. It would be in the lawyer's office. The door would stay open. Nancy would be in the building. The day of the meeting, I arrived early and sat in the waiting area with my purse on my lap. The chair was firm, the kind meant to keep people from settling in too comfortably. I watched the second hand on the wall clock move in small, exact jumps. When Stephen walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked thinner, tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. He stood there for a moment like he wasn't sure where to put himself. We sat across from each other at the conference table. The lawyer stepped out but left the door open, just as promised. No one spoke right away. "I'm sorry," Stephen said finally. His voice was quiet, controlled. "I know that doesn't fix anything." I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence sit between us. I had learned that silence could do work words couldn't. "You didn't make a mistake," I said at last. "You made a plan. There's a difference." He nodded, staring at his hands. "Jessica pushed for it, but I agreed. I signed things I shouldn't have. I thought it would all be easier if you didn't have to manage everything anymore." "You thought it would be easier for you," I said. Not harshly, just accurately. He didn't deny it. I told him what I needed. Again, calmly. Everything returned. A written admission. No contact outside agreed terms. No expectations. No favors. "I'll sign whatever you need," he said. "I know," I replied. "That's why we're here." He looked up then, eyes wet. "Will I ever be able to fix this?" I thought about that, about the year I had lost, about the hallway floor and the words I'd overheard, about the way my body still remembered waking up at 5 without an alarm. "I don't know," I said. "That depends on what you do when no one is watching." The meeting ended shortly after. There was nothing more to say. I walked out without touching him, without hugging him, without offering comfort I no longer had. The transfers were reversed within the week. Deeds returned. Accounts restored. A letter arrived confirming everything was back where it belonged. I placed it in a folder and slid it into a drawer, next to documents I hadn't organized properly in years. A few days later, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a small photo album, my grandson sleeping, my grandson smiling, a note in careful handwriting that said they missed me. I closed the album and put it away, not thrown out, not displayed, just placed somewhere safe. That night, I washed the dishes after dinner and wiped the counter slowly. I made tea and sat at the table with it, letting the steam rise. The apartment felt settled in a way it hadn't before, like it recognized me again. I didn't know yet what role I would play in their lives, or if I would play one at all. I only knew that whatever came next would be on terms I understood, in a life I had chosen back for myself. I put the phone face down, finished my tea, and sat there a little longer. Then I waited. The settlement became official on a quiet Tuesday. No courtroom, no speeches, just signatures, initials, and a final confirmation email from the lawyer that said everything had been executed as agreed. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to see the words sit still on the screen. Your assets have been fully restored. I closed the laptop and sat there for a moment, hands folded, listening to the hum of my refrigerator. That sound had been with me for years. I had just never been present enough to notice it. Stephen sent one message that day. It was short. "Thank you for not ruining us." I didn't reply. I didn't feel the need to correct him or reassure him. What had happened wasn't about ruining anyone. It was about stopping something that shouldn't have been happening at all. A week passed, then another. I went back to my routines slowly. Morning walks, a proper breakfast eaten sitting down, laundry done for myself when I felt like it. I noticed how much time there was in a day when no one else's schedule owned it. One afternoon, Nancy suggested I think about what I wanted next. Not what I should do. Not what would look generous. Just what I wanted. I didn't answer right away. That night, I took out the photo album they'd sent and opened it again. I looked carefully this time. My grandson's face had changed even in the short span since I last held him. Fuller cheeks, a different expression around the eyes. I felt something steady and quiet settle in my chest. I called Stephen the next morning. "I want to see the baby," I said when he answered, "but I need to be clear about how." He didn't interrupt. He listened. "One afternoon a week," I continued. 2 hours. I come to visit. I don't clean. I don't cook. I don't help. I'm there as a grandmother, not as staff. If that changes, I leave." There was a pause. Then he said, "We understand." The first visit felt strange. I dressed carefully, not formally, just neatly. Clothes that felt like me. When I arrived, I rang the doorbell instead of using the key I still had. Jessica opened the door and stepped aside without comment. The apartment looked different. Cleaner. Quieter. Like people had learned how to live in it instead of waiting for someone else to manage it. When she placed the baby in my arms, he stared at me for a long moment, then smiled. A real smile, the kind that doesn't require effort. I sat on the couch with him and stayed there. I didn't get up. I didn't scan the room for things that needed attention. I just held him and let the time pass. Stephen and Jessica stayed back. They watched. They didn't ask for anything. That mattered more than any apology. When the 2 hours were up, I stood and handed the baby back. "I'll see you next week," I said, and I left. That became the pattern. They adjusted. They learned. They managed without me filling the gaps. And I learned something too, that being present didn't have to mean being consumed. One afternoon, months later, Stephen handed me an envelope before I left. Inside was a check. "For the year," he said, not as a favor, as acknowledgement. I hesitated, then took it. Not because I needed it, but because accepting it closed something properly. I deposited it the next day and used part of it to book a short trip with Nancy. Nothing extravagant, just a change of scenery. The rest I left untouched. Some things I had learned were best kept as proof that your time has value, even to yourself. When I got home from that trip, I cleaned my kitchen, made tea, and sat at the table as the light shifted across the floor. Everything felt in order, not perfect, just steady, and for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Sunday afternoons became quiet markers in my week. I didn't rush them. I didn't prepare the way I used to. I left my apartment when it felt right, took the same train, sat in the same seat, and watched the city pass without rehearsing conversations in my head. When I arrived, I rang the doorbell and waited. That pause mattered. It reminded me I was choosing to be there. My grandson learned my voice before he learned many words. He'd look up when I spoke, then reach out without hesitation. I sat on the couch and stayed there. I didn't scan the room. I didn't offer suggestions. I let the time be what it was. Stephen and Jessica kept their distance in a respectful way, not cold, just appropriate. When they spoke, it was to share something small, the baby's first steps, a new habit, a change in schedule. They didn't ask for help. They didn't hint. I noticed the effort, and I acknowledged it by continuing to show up on my terms. At home, my life filled out again. I cleaned when I wanted to. I left dishes overnight without apologizing to myself. I took long walks in the park and noticed how the seasons moved without consulting anyone. Nancy came by often. We cooked simple meals and sat at the table long after we were finished eating, talking about nothing important. One afternoon at a cafe, a woman at the next table leaned over and asked me how I'd learned to say no so calmly. She said it like it was something she wanted to practice. I didn't give advice. I just smiled and told her it took time and paperwork and a willingness to sit in silence until things became clear. That stayed with me. A few weeks later, another woman from my building knocked on my door to ask about a letter she didn't understand from her bank. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd once felt lost, and went through it line by line. Nothing dramatic, just reading, pausing, understanding. After she left, I wiped the table, made tea, and stood by the window while it cooled. This was my life now: order, choice, quiet competence. On Sundays, I held my grandchildren and felt present without being depleted. On weekdays, I lived in my own space without guilt. Nothing was rushed, nothing was taken for granted. I missed a train once and heard something I was never meant to hear. But I also learned how to listen carefully, how to wait, and how to let systems do the work when emotions couldn't. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. If it felt familiar in any way, you're not alone. Before you go, please like the video and subscribe if you enjoy calm, real stories like this. Let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. 2 more stories will appear next, one just like this and one you might not expect. I'll see you there.